The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi as Admiral Chuichi Nagumo surveyed his formidable fleet. 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, cut through the Pacific waters with the confidence of an empire that had known only victory. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Navy felt invincible, their Zero fighters having swept aside all opposition from Hawaii to the Dutch East Indies. Signal from Admiral Yamamoto, called out, a communications officer, his voice carrying across the bridge. The message was brief but decisive. Proceed with Operation MI, the assault on Midway Atoll. This tiny speck of coral and sand, barely 2 miles across, would serve as the bait to draw out the remaining American Pacific Fleet for final destruction. Nagumo nodded grimly, his weathered face reflecting years of naval tradition and recent triumph. The plan seemed flawless. Strike Midway with overwhelming force, then annihilate the American carriers when they inevitably rushed to defend this strategic outpost. Intelligence reports suggested the Americans possessed only 2 or 3 operational carriers in the entire Pacific. Against Japan's concentrated might of 4 fleet carriers and their veteran aircrew, it would be a massacre. Below decks, Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, briefed his pilots with characteristic intensity. "Gentlemen, we have never known defeat," he declared, his voice carrying the absolute certainty that had driven Japan's expansion across the Pacific. "Today, we complete what we began 6 months ago. The American Navy dies at Midway." The pilots, their faces young but hardened by months of combat, nodded with the quiet confidence of professionals who had dominated every engagement. They had swept the Royal Navy from Southeast Asian waters, crushed the Dutch fleet in the Java Sea, and sent countless Allied vessels to the bottom. Their Kate torpedo bombers and Val dive bombers had proven unstoppable, while the legendary Zero fighter had established air superiority wherever Japanese forces advanced. According to naval historian Gordon Prange's comprehensive account, miracle. At Midway, Japanese confidence was not mere arrogance but based on an unbroken string of tactical victories that had established their naval aviation as the world's finest. As the task force approached Midway in the pre-dawn darkness, radio chatter crackled with the routine efficiency of a well-oiled war machine. The destroyer screens maintained perfect formation, while the heavy cruisers Chikuma and Tony prepared to launch their reconnaissance float planes. Everything proceeded according to the meticulous planning that had characterized Japanese military operations since the war's beginning. Yet beneath this surface confidence, subtle tensions existed. Some officers privately wondered about American capabilities. Their industrial capacity remained intact, and 6 months provided considerable time for recovery and preparation. Admiral Yamamoto himself had expressed concerns about prolonged conflict with America's vast resources, but such doubts were buried beneath the intoxicating momentum of continuous victory. The die was cast. As June 4th dawned clear and bright over the Central Pacific, the greatest naval battle in history was about to unfold, and Japan's seemingly unstoppable advance would face its first real test against an enemy they had consistently underestimated. 300 miles northeast of the approaching Japanese fleet, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance stood on the bridge of the USS Enterprise, his calm demeanor masking the tremendous weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Unlike his Japanese counterparts, Spruance commanded with the quiet desperation of a nation that had absorbed terrible defeats but refused to surrender. The American force appeared pathetically outnumbered. Only 3 aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, against Japan's 4. What the Japanese didn't know was that American codebreakers had achieved the impossible. They had cracked the Japanese naval code JN-25, providing Admiral Chester Nimitz with detailed knowledge of Operation MI's timing, target, and composition. "Admiral, we have confirmation," reported the intelligence officer, his voice tight with suppressed excitement. "Japanese carriers are exactly where Station Hypo predicted. They're launching their first strike against Midway now." Commander Edwin Layton, Nimitz's intelligence chief, had staked his career on the accuracy of their code breaking. The intercepts revealed not just Japanese intentions, but their fatal assumption that American carriers were still in Pearl Harbor. This miscalculation would prove catastrophic. But first, Spruance had to position his forces perfectly to exploit the intelligence advantage. On Midway itself, Marine pilots prepared for what they knew would likely be suicide missions. Major Lofton Henderson adjusted his squadron's formation, knowing their obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters stood little chance against the legendary Zeros. Yet someone had to buy time for the carriers to launch their own strikes. The first Japanese attack wave, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, approached Midway at 0730 hours. 108 aircraft, 36 Kate bombers, 36 Valdive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters represented the finest naval aviation force ever assembled. They swept aside Midway's desperate fighter defense with brutal efficiency, the outclassed American and Marine pilots falling like autumn leaves before the Japanese onslaught. But as bombs rained down on Midway's installations, Tominaga made a crucial radio transmission. There is need for a second attack. The airfield remained operational despite the devastating assault. This single message would alter history's course, as Admiral Nagumo faced the first of several critical decisions that would doom his fleet. Naval historian Walter Lord documented in Incredible Victory how this moment marked the beginning of Japan's tactical unraveling, as Nagumo was forced to choose between immediate offensive action and thorough preparation. Meanwhile, American torpedo bombers from all three carriers launched desperate attacks against the Japanese fleet. These obsolete Douglas Devastators, flying low and slow, approached the Japanese carriers like lambs to slaughter. The experienced Japanese Combat Air Patrol, flying their nimble Zeros, tore through the American formations with mechanical precision. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet suffered complete annihilation. 29 of 30 aircrew died, with only Ensign George Gay surviving to witness the battle from the water. Torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown met similar fates, their antiquated aircraft no match for Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Yet these sacrificial attacks served a crucial purpose. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol descended to sea level to massacre the torpedo bombers, leaving the high-altitude approaches undefended. At precisely 10:24 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers from Enterprise spotted the Japanese carriers through a break in the clouds. Below them, the Japanese flight decks lay exposed and vulnerable, crowded with aircraft, being refueled and rearmed for the second Midway strike. It was the perfect moment to attack, achieved through American sacrifice, Japanese overconfidence, and the kind of split-second timing that decides the fate of nations. The sight below McCluskey's Douglas Dauntless dive bombers would have taken any pilot's breath away. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers steamed in perfect formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft in various stages of preparation. Fuel lines snaked across the decks while ordnance crews hurriedly switched bomb loads from land attack to anti-ship weapons. Admiral Nagumo's fateful decision to prepare for a second Midway strike instead of immediately engaging the American carriers. "Target the carriers," McCluskey radioed to his squadrons, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Lieutenant Richard Best selected the Akagi, flagship of the striking force, while Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's Yorktown dive bombers approached from another angle, targeting the Soryu. The Japanese, caught completely off guard with their Combat Air Patrol at sea level and their carriers vulnerable, could only watch in horror as American dive bombers screamed down from 14,000 feet. At exactly 10:26 a.m., Best's 1,000-pound bomb struck Akagi just behind her island superstructure. The explosion penetrated to the hangar deck, where armed and fueled aircraft awaited launch. Secondary explosions erupted in a chain reaction of fuel and ordnance that transformed Japan's premier aircraft carrier into a floating inferno within minutes. Simultaneously, the Kaga absorbed multiple bomb hits that ignited similar catastrophic fires. Her flight deck buckled under the explosive force while her seasoned aircrew, irreplaceable veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Dutch East Indies, and countless Pacific battles, perished in the flames or leapt into the sea to escape the Holocaust. The Soryu suffered an equally devastating fate as Yorktown's dive bombers found their mark. 3 direct hits turned her into a blazing wreck, her aviation gasoline creating towering pillars of black smoke visible for miles across the Pacific. Within 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers, the elite backbone of their naval aviation, lay mortally wounded, their experienced aircrew dead or dying. Historian Mitsuo Fuchida, who survived the battle, later wrote in Midway, "The battle that doomed Japan," that these 5 minutes represented the turning point not just of the battle, but of the entire Pacific War, as Japan lost its offensive capability in a single catastrophic moment. Aboard the Hiryu, the sole surviving Japanese carrier, Admiral Taman Yamaguchi watched the destruction of his colleagues with grim determination. A graduate of Princeton University and one of Japan's most capable naval commanders, Yamaguchi understood immediately that the battle, and perhaps the war, hung in the balance. "Prepare all aircraft for immediate launch," he ordered. "We must strike the American carriers before they can finish us." The Hiryu's revenge came swiftly. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters against the USS Yorktown, achieving what Japanese naval aviation did best: precise, coordinated attack. 3 bombs struck the American carrier, penetrating her flight deck and starting serious fires. For a moment, it appeared Japan might salvage something from the disaster. But American damage control, honed through months of desperate fighting and innovative techniques, proved remarkably effective. Within hours, Yorktown's crew had extinguished the fires and restored flight operations, a feat that would have been impossible for any other navy. When a second Japanese strike found her still operational, the attackers assumed they had discovered a different carrier, testament to American resilience and technical skill. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the Pacific, the magnitude of Japan's disaster became clear. The mobile force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months lay in ruins, their veteran aircrew, trained over years of peacetime preparation, dead or scattered. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu would all be scuttled by Japanese destroyers to prevent capture, taking with them Japan's hopes of decisive victory. The rising sun that had illuminated Japanese confidence that morning now set on an empire that had reached its furthest expansion. The tide of war in the Pacific had turned in 5 minutes of American dive bombing, and Japan would never again possess the offensive capability to threaten American naval supremacy. As smoke from 3 burning Japanese carriers darkened the afternoon sky, Admiral Yamaguchi aboard the Hiryu faced the bitter reality of commanding Japan's sole remaining fleet carrier in a battle that had already been decided. The Princeton-educated officer, known throughout the Imperial Navy for his tactical brilliance and aggressive spirit, refused to accept defeat while his ship remained operational. "Launch everything we have," Yamaguchi commanded, his voice carrying the desperation of a man who understood that Japan's entire Pacific strategy hung by the thread of his single carrier's survival. The Hiryu's remaining aircraft, 10 Kate torpedo bombers escorted by 6 Zeros, represented the last offensive punch of what had been the world's most powerful carrier striking force just hours earlier. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, who had led the morning's attack on Midway and reported the need for a second strike that doomed the Japanese fleet, volunteered to lead this final mission, despite his aircraft's damaged fuel tank. The irony was not lost on him. The pilot whose radio transmission had set in motion the Japanese disaster would now attempt to salvage it through personal sacrifice. The American carriers, having achieved their stunning victory, now faced the sobering task of finishing off their wounded enemy. Aboard the Enterprise, Admiral Spruance weighed his options with the methodical calculation that characterized his command style. Intelligence reports suggested additional Japanese forces approached from the west. Admiral Yamamoto's main battle fleet with its massive battleships and heavy cruisers. According to Samuel Eliot Morrison's official naval history, The Two-Ocean War, Spruance's decision to pursue the remaining Japanese carrier while avoiding Yamamoto's surface fleet demonstrated the tactical wisdom that would define American naval strategy for the remainder of the Pacific War. At 5:03 p.m., Lieutenant I. Earl Gallagher's dive bombers from Enterprise located the Hiryu steaming desperately northward, her flight deck empty after launching her final strike. The attack that followed mirrored the morning's devastating assault. 4 direct hits transformed Japan's last operational carrier into another funeral pyre, her veteran crew sharing the fate of their comrades on the other 3 carriers. Admiral Yamaguchi, facing the destruction of his command and the certain knowledge that Japan had lost the battle, chose death over dishonor. He went down with his ship, one of many experienced Japanese naval officers whose loss would prove irreplaceable in the years ahead. The cream of Japan's naval aviation, pilots, aircrew, mechanics, and commanders who had trained for years before the war, perished in a single day's fighting. The USS Yorktown, heavily damaged by Japanese attacks but still afloat, presented a final dramatic chapter to the battle. As salvage crews worked desperately to save the veteran carrier, the Japanese submarine I-168 penetrated the destroyer screen and delivered the coup de grace. 2 torpedoes sent the Yorktown and her escort destroyer Hammond to the bottom, providing Japan's only significant victory in an otherwise catastrophic defeat. But this minor success could not mask the magnitude of Japan's disaster. 4 fleet carriers, their entire complement of experienced aircrew, and most importantly, the offensive capability that had driven Japanese expansion across the Pacific, lay at the bottom of the ocean or drifting as burned-out hulks. Admiral Yamamoto, receiving reports of the catastrophe from his flagship 300 miles away, ordered a general withdrawal that acknowledged Japan's first major defeat of the Pacific War. As June 6th dawned over empty seas littered with debris and oil slicks, the strategic balance in the Pacific had shifted permanently. Japan's mobile force, which had struck Pearl Harbor, devastated the Dutch East Indies, and driven British naval power from Southeast Asian waters, had been annihilated in a single day's fighting. The empire that had expanded relentlessly for 6 months would now begin its long retreat toward the home islands. The silence that settled over the Central Pacific on June 7th marked more than the end of a battle. It signaled the beginning of Japan's irreversible decline as a naval power. In the clear morning light, search planes from the surviving American carriers found only debris fields and oil slicks, where the mighty Japanese mobile force had steamed with such confidence just 3 days earlier. Admiral Chester Nimitz, receiving battle reports at his Pearl Harbor headquarters, immediately grasped the strategic implications of Spruance's victory. "The Japanese will never again be able to mount a major offensive operation," he told his staff with characteristic understatement. The intelligence coup that had made the victory possible, Station Hypo's breaking of the Japanese naval code, would remain classified for decades, but its impact was immediately apparent to American naval leadership. In Tokyo, the news of the Midway disaster struck the Naval General Staff like a physical blow. 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers lost, along with over 300 aircraft and their veteran aircrew, represented a catastrophe from which Japan could never fully recover. The industrial capacity to build replacement carriers existed, but the years required to train experienced pilots and aircrew did not. Japan's naval aviation, built painstakingly over 2 decades of preparation, had been largely destroyed in a single day. Military historian John Keegan noted in The Second World War that Midway represented the classic decisive battle, where superior intelligence and tactical execution overcame apparent numerical disadvantage, fundamentally altering the strategic balance of the entire Pacific conflict. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and advocate for decisive battle, absorbed the full implications of defeat with stoic acceptance. The gamble for quick victory had failed catastrophically, and Japan now faced the prolonged war of attrition he had always feared. American industrial superiority, temporarily negated by surprise attack and tactical brilliance, would now assert itself with crushing inevitability. The immediate aftermath revealed the extent of Japanese losses. Beyond the 4 carriers and their aircrew, Japan had lost the psychological advantage of invincibility that had driven their expansion across the Pacific. Allied forces throughout the theater, from Australia to the Aleutians, took heart from news that the seemingly unstoppable Japanese Navy had been decisively defeated. For the United States, Midway provided the breathing space necessary to mobilize America's vast industrial and human resources for the long Pacific campaign ahead. The Essex-class aircraft carriers already under construction would soon provide numerical superiority to match the tactical advantages demonstrated at Midway. American pilot training programs, expanded dramatically after Pearl Harbor, would produce aircrew in numbers that Japan could never match. The battle's strategic consequences extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. Japan's failure to eliminate American naval power in the Central Pacific preserved the vital Hawaii-Australia lifeline and maintained American ability to support Allied forces throughout the theater. The planned invasion of Australia became impossible, while Japanese advances in the Southwest Pacific ground to a halt as resources were diverted to defend newly vulnerable positions. More subtly, Midway began the process of Japanese strategic overextension that would characterize the remainder of the Pacific War. Without the naval aviation strength to support further expansion, Japan was forced into a defensive posture for which its military doctrine and national psychology were fundamentally unsuited. The initiative passed permanently to American forces, who would use it to launch the island-hopping campaign that would eventually reach Japan's home islands. The human cost of Japan's defeat extended beyond immediate battle casualties. The loss of experienced aircrew represented an irreplaceable depletion of Japan's most vital military resource. These men, trained over years of peacetime preparation and seasoned through months of victorious combat, could not be quickly replaced by hastily trained recruits, no matter how brave or dedicated. 3 years after the smoke cleared from the Midway battlefield, Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast echoed across a Japan reduced to rubble by American bombing and blockade. The path from Midway to Tokyo Bay was neither straight nor inevitable, but the battle had established the strategic framework that made ultimate American victory possible. What began as Japan's confidence giving way to defeat at a tiny Pacific atoll had evolved into the complete collapse of the Japanese Empire. The veterans who survived Midway on both sides carried different memories of those crucial June days. For Americans like Wade McCluskey and Richard Best, the battle represented validation of American fighting spirit and technological capability. Their dive-bombing attacks, executed with split-second timing and deadly precision, had demonstrated that Japanese naval aviation, for all its skill and experience, was not invincible when confronted by courage, preparation, and superior intelligence. Japanese survivors like Mitsuo Fuchida faced the more difficult task of reconciling their early war successes with the catastrophic defeat that had doomed their nation's Pacific ambitions. In post-war writings, many Japanese officers acknowledged that Midway had been the decisive moment when Japan's strategic initiative passed irretrievably to American forces. The confidence that had driven expansion from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean died in the flames of 4 aircraft carriers. Post-war analysis by both Japanese and American historians, documented comprehensively in Gordon Pranga's Miracle at Midway, established that the battle's outcome hinged on a combination of American code-breaking success, Japanese tactical errors, and the kind of split-second timing that often decides the fate of nations in war. The strategic lessons of Midway extended far beyond naval aviation tactics to fundamental questions of intelligence, logistics, and national will. American success in breaking Japanese codes provided the crucial advantage that allowed inferior forces to achieve decisive victory through superior positioning and timing. This intelligence coup, replicated throughout the Pacific War, demonstrated the growing importance of information warfare in modern conflict. Japan's defeat illustrated the dangers of strategic overextension and the irreplaceable nature of experienced military personnel. The veteran aircrew lost at Midway represented years of training and combat experience that could never be adequately replaced, regardless of Japan's industrial capacity or national determination. In modern warfare, skilled personnel had become as important as ships, aircraft, or weapon systems. For Admiral Nimitz and the American Pacific Fleet, Midway provided the foundation for an offensive strategy that would eventually encompass the Central Pacific drive through the Marshalls, Marianas, and Philippines. The carrier task forces that had achieved victory at Midway would multiply into the vast armadas that dominated the Pacific by 1944, their tactical doctrines refined through the lessons learned in those crucial 5 minutes when American dive bombers found the Japanese carriers exposed and vulnerable. The battle's broader significance lay in its demonstration that technological and numerical superiority could be overcome through superior intelligence, tactical innovation, and individual courage. The American victory proved that democratic societies, properly organized and motivated, could match and exceed the military effectiveness of totalitarian regimes that had appeared invincible through early war successes. As the 75th anniversary of Midway approached in 2017, historians continued to debate specific tactical decisions and their consequences. But the battle's fundamental meaning remained clear. June 4, 1942, marked the day when Japan's Pacific advance reached its limit and began the long retreat that would end in unconditional surrender 3 years later. The confident Japanese fleet that had approached, Midway expecting easy victory, became instead a testament to the unpredictable nature of warfare and the decisive importance of intelligence, preparation, and courage in determining the fate of nations. Japan's confidence had indeed given way to defeat at Midway, and with it, the rising sun's dream of Pacific domination died beneath the waves of the Central Pacific.